Okay, so greetings, hello, welcome to the Philosophy Club here in Little Batet. It's sort of that time of week, and we have some new guests here who've just arrived in the village, which is jolly exciting. They'll be adding to our proceedings. So, to start with, like normal, I'm going to run down what I've been up to this week on the peace front here in the European Peace Museum, which is also called the Musée des Muses. I hear it's bilingual, we have a French name, the Musée des Muses. The Museum of the Muses, which is the only one in the world dedicated to the 9 Muses, as one discovers on the tour. And they were goddesses of inspiration who inspire philosophers. And Plato founded the Academy in Athens dedicated to the 9 Muses, which is why I've sort of kept that tradition alive. So, what's going on in the world? Well, I just want to start by just referencing the terrible tragic fire in Los Angeles. I have dear friends in Los Angeles, I've been there. I have a lot of, like all the world, we all kind of look to Los Angeles for Hollywood and for the products that inspire our collective imagination through the film world. I've just watched an absolutely brilliant film this week called A Dangerous Method about Freud and Jung's relationship, and Sabina Spielrein. There are some serious films come out of Hollywood, and it's just an absolute tragedy. So many people's homes have been destroyed, more than 11,000. I mean, it's incalculable. And people's lives and all their savings and, all their books and libraries and the whole thing, right? And the number of cultural things have gone up. I know that as a philosopher, I'm very interested in theosophy, esoteric study of world religions, founded by Blavatsky and Annie Besant. It's on one of our esoteric boxes, and the world's largest archive of theosophical materials in Los Angeles. Irreplaceable, unique letters by the founders of the Theosophical Society, people like Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott, and they've all gone up in smoke. That entire thing has been destroyed. 40,000 precious books, rare editions, some of them like 1600s, ancient books, also ancient manuscripts from India and Burma and places, all gone up in smoke. So, I'm just, I think it's an amazing lesson for us all about impermanence, because theosophy teaches, Blavatsky became a Buddhist, as did Olcott, and they wanted to bring back the ancient wisdom of the East and blend it with the ancient wisdom of the West, like the Druid wisdom. And Blavatsky writes about the Druids a lot in her works. In my Encyclopedia of Druid Studies, I referenced all the instances, and she said they were the keepers of the wisdom of the West, like the Buddhists and the Hindus are of the East. So I've been thinking a lot about Agni, the god of fire, and the impermanence of life. I think it should keep us all on our toes more to appreciate the present moment whilst we have it still. And if you think about it, if you see the ruins of Los Angeles from the air, the areas that have been desecrated, it looks to me just like Gaza. Some of the streets, there are no more houses, nothing there, just, It's as if Gaza's come to downtown Los Angeles, which is a horrible thing to say and a way to look at it, but it's true. We should have been doing more to stop the desecration of Gaza, to stop the bombardment. Biden should have done more to not give weapons to make it possible. And I think if you want to research and you look at things esoterically as I do, you look at the karma of all this, I would want to rewind and not let any of this happen, and somehow get healing and peacemaking. This is why I'm trying to build a nonagon on the top floor of the Pentagon with a bunch of people in the States, visionary dreamers like Marianne Williamson, who stood as presidential candidate on the peace ticket, and she is from LA. And she and her people set up a thing called the Peace Alliance in America, which I've spoken to. And we want to build a peace department. I think it should be on top of the Pentagon, symbolically, which is a long, huge, flat building. We've got a Leonardo da Vinci Peace Prize for the architects that design it to go on the top. And that would be just for peace work. So that when things come up in the world, like Gaza, Israel, start fighting, or Ukraine, Russia, they send in teams of mediators. They send in educators. They send in people that can heal these conflicts, instead of giving one side or the other weapons and just, so that's what the Pentagon likes doing, and it gets loads of money for it. Well, we've got to activate the peace message on the planet, is how I see it. And I think this fire in LA is a kind of wake-up call. That's what we've got to do. There aren't enough films coming out of Hollywood on peace. Too many war films, too many cowboy films, So it's a hard lesson, but I think it's one that we need to, up our game on. The other thing I want to announce is I've been promising this, but finally it's published in this journal called Teaching Religion and Theology, or Teaching Theology and Religion, which is published in California by Wiley, an essay or a paper by me about the periodic table, how it was created, why, what it does, why it should be in every school worldwide, why it should be in a big poster format, on every classroom that teaches humanities and religious studies. Like every physics and chemistry department has a periodic table of the elements. So I think our table should be on every classroom that teaches humanities and philosophy and religious studies, and every university department. So I want it to become as well known. So it's good that it's being published this week actually. And what else? I've been involved, as usual, in various sort of online events, and I'm actually on the executive committee of the Liberal Democrat Party, which is, I think we should all be active. I don't think we should sit back and leave politics to the other guys. I think we actually have to make a stand. And having weighed it all up carefully, I've been a member of the Liberal Democrats for, on and off for a couple of decades, because they stand for, let's call it left, centre, progressive policies, common sense stuff. And they utterly oppose Brexit, and they totally stand opposite to everything the Tory party have been doing. So this is, and I stand in the tradition of the old sort of 19th century liberal tradition, which gave us people like Gladstone, who was a progressive thinker. It gave us Lloyd George, who brought us pensions. They brought national insurance in. And they brought the. So Gladstone, when he died, he was a great thinker actually, as well as a politician. He was an intellectual, a proper liberal in the best sense of the word. He left his home as a gift to the nation. And it's now run as a library called St Daniel's Library. It's in North Wales. I organised a conference there. You can go and sleep overnight. It's got bedrooms. It's a beautiful place, and it's his personal library of like 80,000 books, which is even bigger than mine. He was a real savant in that Victorian sense. He was also a spiritualist. He was interested in what happens after death, like they were in the Victorian times. He was a friend of Queen Victoria, who shared with him a passion for spiritualism. You can imagine some of their conversations must have been very interesting when he would have to go to Buckingham Palace for his weekly meeting. I think, she was also a very clever woman, Victoria. But I don't think, you see, the current crop of politicians in the Tory field are very poor substitutes. I mean, there's not a single brain cell among them. They're doing unethical things like Brexit and just, destroying the cohesion of our society in Britain. That is what I believe in. that it doesn't matter what your class is, your social standing, your money, we're all humans, we should look out for each other. And so that's why I joined the Lib Dems and I'm active, and I'm on the committee for the French, membership. We only have a few hundred members, but it's better than nothing. And we can input into Lib Dem policy in Westminster. So, for instance, I've proposed this week that, because one of the problems is getting British citizens who vote to bother to vote. Once they've left Britain, they sort of forget, they don't care anymore. And there's a couple of million of Brits abroad, but only a few tens of thousands bother to vote in elections. So we're trying to think of ways to actually get people to bother. And I've come up with this idea. I think every British citizen, wherever you are in the world, should once a year get a constitutional news update, like a little bulletin, a PDF, just giving you the basic facts of this is the government, this is the last general election results, this is the laws that are currently going through, this is the change that they're making to the boundaries, this is what's being proposed about relations with Europe, just basic facts of stuff, especially that will affect the Constitution, like major stuff. And it would be non-party, it would be authored by the Hansard Society, which is the body that records Parliament, and it could be co-written by University College Constitutional Department for Political Science, so it would be factual stuff. And if that was sent, and it would cost virtually nothing, because it could go as a PDF to everyone's emails, and it might get people thinking, well, it's interesting, this stuff. Like this Tory MP's just been convicted for lying and paedophilia, and he's been thrown out of Parliament. That's interesting. I've made a list of 10 things that be in the newsletter. One of them is criminal behaviour by parliamentarians. So I think that's important. People should know. Anyway, that's what I'm doing. And I'm just finally in the midst of publishing my 99 Names of Peace, which has been delayed by a week for technical reasons. But I did publish the second edition of my dictionary of global philosophical terminology, which was this edition. The first edition was only 75 pages. The edition I've just published this week is 370.
Oh, God.
So it's grown because I've added loads more details and languages. So that's exciting. And then finally, I want to mention a couple of other things. So we're having a meeting with the Lib Dems about what should be the Liberal Democrat response, or just Liberal response, to the rise of far-right populism, which is a thing in Europe, in America with Trump, and in Russia with Putin. And if you haven't read it, I want to recommend and read a passage from this book, The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe and America, by Professor Timothy Snyder, who's like the American equivalent of me. He's got a PhD on the history of Ukrainian intellectual life. He studied a particular amazing sociologist. He teaches at Princeton, I believe. And his knowledge of what's been going on in Ukraine and Russia is greater than anyone else. You see, I used to do East European and Russian history. That was my degree, was part in that. And I kept very much in touch during my peace work. But I thought the Russians were sensible, rational people we could work with and make peace with. The ones I met were. I know quite a few leading Russian philosophers. And when I was in Moscow, Gorbachev was still in power just at the end of his time in 1990. And then I went back in 93 to the World Congress of Philosophy, and I met some brilliant minds. They wanted to talk peace. And I was elected coordinator of philosophers of peace in the world, right, by this conference. But what happened when my back was turned is these extreme right people got into power. And they all aggregated around Putin, who pretends to be an intellectual. He's got the rhetorical gifts that he learned in his KGB training, but he doesn't have the depth of thought. And I just want to read something. Okay. And what's important is Snyder explains why Putin thinks the way he does, right? Russians educated in the 1970s, including the leaders and war propagandists of now, were instructed that fascist meant anti-Russian. In the Russian language, it is practically a grammatical error to imagine that a Russian could be a fascist. In contemporary Russian discourse, it is easier for an actual Russian fascist to call a non-fascist Ukrainian a fascist than it is for a non-fascist to call a Russian fascist a fascist. Thus, a fascist like Dugin could celebrate the victory of fascism in fascist language, while condemning as fascist his opponents. Ukrainians defending their country were called junta mercenaries from the ranks of the Ukrainian swine fascists, quote unquote. Similarly, a fascist like Prokhanov could describe fascism as a physical substance that spilled in from the West to threaten Russian virginity. In June, Prokhanov wrote of fascism as black sperm that threatened the golden goddesses of Eurasia, quote unquote. His lapidary expression of racial and sexual anxiety was a perfect fascist text. Glaziev also followed the schizo-fascist protocol. While endorsing Nazi geopolitics, he set a standard for calling Russia's enemies fascist. Schizofascism. So what Snyder's coined this word schizofascism, which describes someone that's basically doesn't understand political science as such, just adopts the terminology and is using it to other people they don't like. Anyway, he goes into it with a fine-tooth comb, and you read here that a war that was supposed to be against fascism, i.e. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, actually many of Russia's allies were fascists. American white supremacists Richard Spencer, Matthew Heimbach, and David Duke celebrated Putin and defended his war. And Russia repaid them by using an approximation of the Confederate battle flag as the emblem of its occupied territories in southeastern Ukraine. The European far right also applauded Russia's war. The Polish fascist Konrad Rekash endorsed Putin's Eurasia concept in general and a Russian invasion of Ukraine in particular. In September 2013, he anticipated that Russia would invade Ukraine and dreamt of leading a Russian-backed government in Poland. Robert Lusnia, once a one-time collaborator with the Polish Communist Secret Police and a financial supporter of Antoni Mackiewicz, a major figure in the Polish right. Together with Rekash, he tried to spread the Russian propaganda line that Ukraine was dominated by Jews. The leader of the Hungarian fascist party, Jobbik, invited by Dugin to Moscow, praised Eurasia. The leader of Bulgaria's fascist party launched an electoral campaign in Moscow. The neo-Nazis of Greece's Golden Dawn praised Russia for defending Ukraine from the ravens of international usury, by which they meant the Jewish international conspiracy. The Italian Fronte Nazionale lauded Putin's courageous position against the powerful gay lobby. America's leading white supremacist Richard Spencer tried to organise a meeting of the European far right in Budapest. Among the invitees were Dugin and the German neo-Nazi Manuel Oschenschreiter, a defender of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, this is an expert speaking. I mean, I don't have time to research all this. I thank Snyder for having done it, but what you see emerging, if you read this book and study it, is the populist far right that Putin represents have certain basic ideas. They're against globalism and internationalism. They're against sexual liberty or freedom of exploration. They're very conservative in that sphere. They're anti-American to the core because it stands as a beacon of sort of constitutionalism. And they're very anti-Jewish, so ironically, not necessarily anti-Zionist, but they're very anti the liberal Jewish, elites that live outside Israel, and are intellectuals, a lot of them. So anyway, that's it's disturbing stuff, but I think we need to know that if we're going to build and build a world based on democratic values, liberal values, human rights, and the Enlightenment principles that France stands for and that our President Macron stands for, and that is embedded deeply into France's political culture, we have to know what we're up against. So that's why I'm just taking time to share that. And then finally, last thing, another book I'm reading at the moment, share a couple of quotes from. This is a really important book called The Question of Zion, by a British Jewish intellectual called Jacqueline Rose, who is involved with Birkbeck College at the University of London, teaching there. She's deputy director, I believe. Now, I used to teach at Birkbeck College back in the day when I lived in London, so I know it. It's a great part of the University of London, which is where my degrees come from. And Jacqueline she's a fascinating thinker. She's a historian, a literary scholar. She's an expert on psychoanalytical thought. She's in this book, she looks at the psychology of Zionism with more detail and more compassionate interest than any other book I've ever read on Zionism. There are two general books on Zionism. There's ones that promote it and say it's the destiny of the Jewish people, we want to build Israel, it's the best thing ever. And then there's people that are very anti-Zionist and say, no, it's a terrible idea, it's terrible for the Palestinians, it's dreadful, we've got to somehow stop it and do something about it. This is a book somewhere in the middle, or transcendental middle, if you want, which is saying we need to study where it came from if we're going to do something about it. There's no point just saying, I don't agree with Zionism. You've got to know where it came from. Mm-hmm. And so what she's done is she's gone deep into the history of it. And I've learned stuff from this book, which I strongly recommend people to read, that I didn't know before. And I'm someone that's been to Israel. I've met philosophers and intellectuals, both Palestinian and Israeli. And I've set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East as a result of those experiences. And I've been trying for the last 20 years to stop these wars in the Middle East. And utterly failing. I feel like total failure. And the reason is because I didn't read this book in time. If only I'd read this book, I would have been much more effective.
Or it had already been written, I suppose. It's quite
new.
No,
I'm kicking myself because, you see, I met her, she used to stay in our family house in Brighton. She was a close friend of my mother. It was written in 2005, which is 20 years ago. Like, where was I? What have I been doing with my life? Why didn't I read this book? I just don't understand it. So, in case you're like me and you haven't read it, I want to share a couple of things from it. The first chapter talks about Zionism and Messianism. She deconstructs the concept of the Messiah, which is central to the Zionist narrative. Most Zionists thought, in their bones, deep down, they didn't say it publicly because they mostly were non-religious Jews. It was 19th century Europe. They didn't invoke the God of Israel and say, we're going to rebuild it because God says. No, they said, no, we just want a nation like everyone else, like Austria, Hungary, France. We want a nation. So they cloaked it as normal nationhood project. But deep down, they were fueled by this messianic idea, is what she reveals. She's gone into the sources of the early Zionists and looked at their diaries, their letters, their books with a fine-tooth comb. And she's looked at the influences on them. And the tragedy is, they thought that by building Israel back in the Holy Land, they would usher in a messianic age for the whole of humanity. The narrative is, the Messiah comes back, everyone lives happily ever after. It's a golden age. That's what they thought they were doing. But she explores, the details of this, and it's very interesting. She quotes a lot from Gershom Scholem, one of the greatest historians of Jewish mysticism, who wrote a book called The Messianic Idea in Judaism. And he was disappointed by Zionism because he said this is false Messianism. This is like Messianism without the Messiah. What they're trying to do is cheat history by building a kind of nation, but actually only the Messiah can do that. And they don't have one. They have a sort of racist ideology. They're trying to build a nation in land that actually isn't theirs. I mean, there's other people living there. And grafting on sort of European ideas about nationhood. And that's going to cause trouble, said Gershom. And so Jacqueline quotes him with amazing prescience. She also discovers, and this is interesting, that one of the great early Zionists was a guy called Shabbatai Zevi, 1600s, who came out as the Messiah. He lived in Smyrna, he was Jewish, and he was a Kabbalist, he was an esoteric thinker, deep guy, and all his disciples loved him, and he announced one day, he said, okay, I am the Messiah. And then he proceeded to appoint people to be king of Persia, you can be king of Israel, you can be king of whatever. He became a megalomaniac, basically. He also said that as the Messiah, I'm now abolishing all laws. So if you want to join my kingdom, you can do anything you want. You can get drunk all day, you can sleep with whoever you want, you can party all night, no laws anymore. And some of his disciples said, this is great, we'll go with this sort of. But others began to be suspicious and said, his credentials are a bit dodgy, actually. Anyway, the Ottoman Sultan heard what was going on and had him brought to Istanbul and said, look, you've got a choice, mate. If you really are going to go on about this Messiah thing, I'm afraid it's execution time. If you convert to Islam, I mean, we're very happy to have you as a new brother. You can carry on, ranting and raving and all that, but we Muslims actually believe Jesus was the Messiah. We don't need any more, thank you very much. We'll just stick with that. And then Muhammad came to cement it and get a backup. So, if you want to become a Muslim, you can live happily ever after. We'll even give you a house. Well, confronted with that choice, he became a Muslim and lived on for a little while. Now, what's interesting, and this bit I didn't know, is it was one of his disciples that persuaded Oliver Cromwell to admit the Jews back into Britain. They'd been kept out for a few hundred years by the medieval kings who, didn't like their usury. But Cromwell said, okay, you can come in. And they've been. So it's interesting, it was Shabbatai Zevi and his disciples that initiated that. And ultimately, it was through Britain and the Balfour Doctrine that Israel's been founded. So Israel goes back to this false Messiah who became a Muslim. So that's, what I love about history is it's so complicated and the twists and turns. The second chapter is on Zionism as psychoanalysis. Because all the founders of Zionism says we're doing this not because it's rational, not because it makes sense, it's beyond logic. We're doing it because it's from the depths. the unconscious. The founder, Theodor Herzl, was a depressive. He had, some mental health issues, we would now say, and he fixated on Zionism as a kind of, like a sort of therapy, I suppose. So anyway, that's an absolutely fascinating chapter. And by the way, his life is just crazy. 2 of his 3 children, Pauline and Hans, committed suicide. And the third, Trudy, was committed to a mental institution. And then her son survived, but then died in a concentration camp in World War II. I mean, it's like, absolute tragedy. This whole story is a tragedy. And what my job as a historian now and philosopher and building on the work of people like Jacqueline Rose is to say, how can we repair this? How can we heal it in spite of all that? Because that's what explains the horror and the violence of Gaza and also Hamas's rejection of Zionism. Is it possible to get a dialogue going? I believe so. And that to me is the job for philosophy. I've discovered, I just want to quote this chap, I've discovered through Jacqueline someone called Ahad Ha'am, who was the philosopher behind Zionism. He actually helped the Balfour Declaration get written. He was an intellectual, but he was very disappointed in what we could call political nationalistic military Zionism. He said, no, that's not what I meant. I wanted a nation that will do redemption for all humanity. I want a nation that will be true to God in the deepest sense and help bring us all back to enlightenment as a planet. I don't want just another nation that's going to have an army and do torture and do violence and bombing just like everyone else. And his critique of this is absolutely fascinating. There's a passage. So nationhood is premised on I am X and you are Y. I'm British, you're French, so we're completely opposite and we'll be enemies till the end of time. This chap said, no, that's not how it works psychologically. We're all parts of each other. I mean, I have French ancestors, I have Norman ancestors, I have Irish ancestors, I have Viking ancestors. I was born in the New World, and that's even before you start talking about reincarnation and past life stuff. I'm sure we've all been around the globe many times. This chap says that identity is is not fixed. It's not like a concrete block. It's more like an ocean. Listen, I want to read this passage. Out of the creative instability of Ahad Ha'am's psychological vision, something even more provisional, suggestive, starts to emerge. If identities are formed mimetically, coercively, hypnotically, they're also on the move. Quotes, more restless than the waves of the sea. They travel across communities in the present as much as to the ancestors of the past. Imitation is promiscuous. As soon as different societies are brought into closer intimacy, fuller acquaintance with one another, identities start to spread and to blur. Imitation widens its scope, becomes intersocial or international. No man, no nation can isolate itself. Moses makes no distinction between man and man, but goes to the aid of strangers. So, that's a little glimpse. That's Jacqueline's prose. She's a brilliant writer. Summing up